Good morning, hoi mora, molweni, sawubonani, dumela, mararasei. It's a pleasure to be here at the 2021 conference of the Agricultural Economics Association of South Africa. Belated 60th birthday to an association that I've been a member of since 1996. I wish I could be there in person. My favorite part of AEASA conference, beyond the academic program, of course, has always been the opportunity to mingle with old friends and also to meet new young students, often over rooibos tea during the tea break and maybe over a good wine during the evening program. While I'm sad that we could not meet in person due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm grateful to the power of technology that is keeping us all connected. Let me start by acknowledging the president of the association, the executive committee, the conference organizing team, and everybody who is working behind the scenes to make this event possible. I am deeply honored to be invited to give this year's Simon Brand Memorial Lecture this year. I stand on the shoulders of great academic giants who have presented these memorial lectures in years past. My talk will focus on a topic that is relatively new to our profession. I'm sure you've all heard of the big buzz around digital technology. Today, I will attempt to answer that question: can digital technologies transform agri-food systems in Africa? My presentation today will be structured as follows. I'll start off by setting the scene by giving you a broad overview of the agricultural context in Africa that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Then I'll move on to highlighting some of the key drivers that are behind the digitalization movement and the rise of digital solutions on the continent. With that, I'll then move to a brief on the status of digital agriculture across the African continent. I will then bring all this closer home by looking at South Africa's digital agricultural profile, sharing some work that I recently did with colleagues at World Bank and African Development Bank. Then we look at the evidence of impact. Are these digital solutions making any difference at all in the lives of smallholder farmers and in our value chains? Then, to be consistent with the theme of the conference, I will examine the impacts, both positive and negative, that COVID-19 has had on digital agricultural solutions. I'll share some conclusions and also draw a few implications for the profession of agricultural economics. By way of background, let's spend a little bit of time looking at Africa's broad agricultural context. I'll not spend too much time on this because I know that I'm preaching to the choir. These are numbers that you're all too familiar with. Africa has about 65% of the world's uncultivated arable land, an estimated 600 million hectares that is still untapped. More than half of Africa's population is engaged in agriculture, especially in rural areas, more than 51%. And yet, due to low productivity and minimal value addition, the sector only contributes 25% to the continent's GDP. As a result, Africa is unable to feed itself, and the continent currently imports between $45 and $50 billion worth of food every year. Now, with demographic changes, an expanding middle class, the youth bulge, urbanization, improving technology and logistical connectivity, evolving dietary preferences, it is estimated that by 2050, there will be 2.5 billion people living on the continent. As population increases, the demand for food will also rise by a staggering 60% compared to today's levels. And there will be growing and higher need for high-value foods such as meat and dairy that will increase by about sixfold. By 2030, the food market on the African continent is projected to reach a staggering $1 trillion. Now, here are the two graphs that keep me up awake at night. And these two graphs to me really encapsulate the challenge of food on the African continent. On the left-hand side, you see the average cereal use for different regions across the world. The top line being North America and Europe, followed by Asia, and then Latin America and the Caribbean. This is data from 1960s to about 2015. At the bottom there is a line for Africa, showing you that there's been very little, if any, growth at all in metric tons per hectare grown. That means that much of the productivity that has come from Africa has come from converting more land from wild into agriculture. So this is what is classically referred to as the yield gap, the difference between what Africa is able to produce per unit of land compared to the rest of the world. Now, when you move to the right-hand side, you get the completely opposite picture. This second graphic here shows you population projections from different regions of the world. You can see a nearly flat line for Asia, Europe, and North America. And the blue line there is the population growth that is coming from Africa. Africa is about the only part of the world where the population is projected to grow significantly over the next 50 to 100 years. You combine these two together, stagnant yields and growing population, and you can tell that if nothing is done, if you continue with business as usual, Africa is likely to face multiple food security crises. Now, this crisis that I'm talking about reminds me of some very famous words by one wise economist. He said that the power of the population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for men that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. Now, this will sound like the words of maybe Greta Thunberg or Al Gore, but no, these are actually the words of Thomas Robert Malthus, who popularized the Malthusian catastrophe, and he said these words in 1798. Now, Malthus was wrong because obviously we have not reached that crisis level yet, because he underestimated the power of technology. Human beings have been able to innovate from that time onwards, and we have been able to stay way ahead and way clear of this Malthusian catastrophe. This is why I'm quite excited to be talking about digital solutions, which is a new frontier of technologies that can boost productivity and efficiency in agricultural food value chains. Now, let's talk about some of the driving forces behind this digital agricultural revolution. The first and maybe by far the most important is that digitization in Africa has been mostly driven by the growth and the penetration of mobile cell phones and internet connectivity, especially over the past decade. Between 2011 and 2015, the pace at which internet connectivity grew in Africa was faster than anywhere else in the world. During that same period, the number of mobile phone subscribers also outpaced the rest of the world with a compounded growth rate of 11% per year compared to about 8% global average. The main factors behind the rise of the mobile phones has been telecom connectivity and the lack of fixed lines in the generation before. Also, second-hand devices and the influx of international mobile cell phone providers has significantly lowered the cost of connectivity by mobile phones. Currently, Africa is about 477 million subscribers, which is about 45%. We have about 80 cell phones for every 100 people. And you can see that mobile internet connectivity is also following closely behind with about 26% penetration. And smartphone usage is also increasing. It's standing right now at about 44%, which is a number that you not expect for much of the continent. Now, this number here, this graph that you see, is really amazing. I challenge you to find any agricultural technology that has enjoyed this rate of rapid adoption over such a short period. A second key driver of the rapid adoption of digital agricultural solutions is indeed Africa's youthful population. What you see here in this graphic is what we used to refer to as the population pyramid. I don't think it qualifies to be called that anymore. Africa has a very youthful population. By these estimates from United Nations, it says that about 3/4 of Africa's population is below the age of 35. 3/4 of the population is below the age of 35. Now, all these young people are key drivers of innovation in any particular area, but most importantly, they are key consumers of digital agricultural solutions. Simply put, these young men and women do not want to do agriculture the same way their parents did it a generation before them. They are eager to adopt new digital solutions. Over the last decade, there's been a growing recognition of the importance of digital agriculture in many developing countries, and indeed in developed countries as well. Now, this was not always the case. Only in 2011, the World Bank produced the first source book that was entitled ICT for Agriculture, or ICT in Agriculture, sorry. It wasn't even called Digital Agriculture then. This was in 2011. In 2013, the ICT for Ag International Conference was hosted in Kigali by CTA. By 2014, the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition was launched. 2016, ICT for Agriculture Annual Conference was launched. And by 2019, which I think 2019 was an amazing year when it comes to digital agriculture, within that year, CTA Dauberg produced the digitalization of African agriculture report. Within the same year, the AGRF theme, African Green Revolution Forum, was entitled Grow Digital, Leveraging Digital Transformation to Drive Sustainable Food Systems in Africa. Within the same year, the Montpellier panel report was entitled Byte by Byte, with a high emphasis on digital solutions for agriculture across the world. Towards the end of that year, ministers of agriculture from about almost all African countries signed a communique entitled Agriculture Goes Digital, Smart Solutions for Future Farming. This all happened in 2019, just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit at the beginning of 2020. So by the time the pandemic hit, all these things are doing set in place that would take advantage of, from policy, investment, regulatory frameworks had already been set in place. And after that, there's been since then an explosion of research and initiatives in the space of digital agriculture. Now, when it comes to digital agriculture, it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about a whole new suite of technologies, most of which were not present 20 years ago. So let's start off with advisory and information services. Here you can talk about customized extension services, market information systems and services, early warning tools for weather and climate advisory, or even pest and disease control. You can also talk about farm management software that makes farming much easier. You can talk about market linkage as well, that is talking about linking farmers to online agri-input and output markets, shared economy for mechanization, like the Uber of tractors, pay-as-you-go irrigation systems. You can also talk about services on supply chain management that look at, for example, traceability solution, enterprise resource planning, agribusiness outgrower schemes that can now be managed on digital platforms, quality assurance systems for farm input and produce that is actually countering the emergence of fake products. You can also talk about fintech, financial access, where you have e-wallet and commitment saving systems targeting smallholder farmers. Also, smallholder farmers can now insure their products, for example, the index-based livestock insurance, IBLI. You can also talk about crowdfunding platforms that are targeting smallholders, farmers, especially the ones that are organized in groups. And lastly, one can look at the macro agricultural intelligence, where digital solutions are providing solutions for government, agricultural sector, for tracking, and they're planning the dashboards. Also, agricultural extension systems, management tools. We can talk about agronomy, research and development, agenda setting, and other digital tools. And most importantly, you can also talk about weather and climate observation for agriculture. All this has been enabled through these digital agricultural tools. The spread of these tools across the African continent is also equally impressive. This here map shows you the spread of digital agri-tech solutions across the African continent, produced by Peter Bridges and CTA. You can see here that the entire continent is pretty much covered with different agri-tech solutions. You can see a concentration here. South Africa is doing extremely well. You see in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, there's a very strong concentration there. When it comes to West Africa, you can see Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Ghana. There is quite a concentration of digital ag solutions that are available to farmers in many regions of Africa now. These are all being funded by multiple donors, including private sector and public sector, African Development Bank, AGRA, Vodafone, GIZ. There is quite a strong initiative that is driving all these technologies. This graphic here from the CTA Dalberg report shows you the rapid growth in the availability of different ag tech solutions. You can see that before 2012, there were only about 42 digital solutions available on the entire African continent. And by the end of 2018, that number had increased to 390. We can safely say by now this number is upwards of 600 in 2021, especially due to COVID. I'll get into that in a little bit. But this is also very unprecedented, the number of unique solutions that are being made available to participants along the entire value chain. Now, I want to add here that some of the biggest impact of digital ag might lie in apps that are not considered as your traditional agricultural applications. We have a lot of social media platforms now, such as Facebook and WhatsApp, that are being used by many farmers to exchange and share information. You have search engines such as Google, YouTube, where farmers can easily get information, and these are not counted in the traditional count of digital solutions. You also have money transfer systems such as Western Union and M-Pesa that are actually availing a lot of finance to smallholder farmers, but they are not counted as part of the fintech solutions. So that is worth keeping in mind. Let's bring the conversation closer to home by looking at the digital agricultural profile in South Africa. This here is a report that was recently published that I co-authored with colleagues at CIAT, African Development Bank, and World Bank. And it looks at characterizes South Africa's digital agricultural profile. I must say South Africa was way ahead of the curve already in this particular area. I recall working in South Africa, I think back in 2010, and then the Western Cape Department of Agriculture already had so many unique solutions that you could term today as digital agricultural solutions. And this is before anybody else was really discussing this, especially in light of smallholder farmers. But South Africa is uniquely positioned to take advantage of these solutions. 67% of South Africa's rural inhabitants have electricity. South Africa is ranked 46th in the world on the Information and Communication Technology Development Index. 56% of South African residents have access to internet, and you have more than 100% penetrations of mobile subscriptions. 80% of those are smartphones. So South Africa is quite ready and prepared to take advantage of digital solutions. This report highlights several critical points of interventions along South Africa's agri-food system. Starting on the input level, it recommends Bluetooth low energy technology for tracking and traceability of inputs to guarantee quality and increase accountability. There's also a recommendation about remote sensing and drones for precision agriculture. When it comes to the production on the farm, there is a recommendation of mobile applications that can increase farmers' participation in agricultural value chains by connecting them to market and service providers. It also recommends smart contracts to leverage blockchain technology to ensure that agreements are transparent and executed fairly. At the distribution level, the report recommends digital platforms and big data analytics, as well as fleet tracking that is supposed to reduce transportation costs by lowering fuel consumption and theft. Looking at the specific areas, again a little bit more in depth, you can see at the input level, the challenges identified is quality inputs, including agrochemicals and fertilizers, is not guaranteed. And the solution there is Bluetooth low energy technology that can be used to track inputs along the entire value chain. When it comes to water scarcity, which is critical for many parts of South Africa, they recommend that remote sensing and drones can be used for precision agriculture. And then the outcome would be that water is used sparingly and precisely via irrigated systems when rainfall is insufficient. When it comes to poor timing of government-supplied inputs, such as seed and fertilizer and pesticides, they recommend that an online platform would lead to better coordination between government and farmers for improved livelihoods. This analysis shows you the level at which these different progress, policy, potential efficiency and equity and environment is actually being assessed at the moment in South Africa. You can see at producer level, this is at farmer level, the lower farmer participation in value chains. They recommend mobile apps to connect farmers to markets. And for lack of information on climate and weather, we can also integrate seamless weather and climate forecasting paired with advisory apps. There is low participation of youth in agriculture as a career option. They recommend online training for agribusiness, farm management, agro-processing. And there's an informal, inconsistent, and unforeseeable agreements that enable corruption to increase risk. And this is where smart contracts can come in as a way of automatically executing information based on code, enabling transparent and fair execution of terms. Now, the million-dollar question here is, are all these digital solutions making any difference at all? To answer this question, Posiello, Coggins, Atunba Payne, and I recently completed a systematic scoping review and published this report. It's entitled, How Are Farmers Using Digital Services in Low and Medium Income Countries? We used a machine learning algorithm to review more than 7,000 studies using a systemic scoping review method. This is a decision-making framework that determines whether individual articles present evidence of impact. I do encourage you to visit this website at the bottom, where you can actually look, learn, and interact with the data more intimately. Since this method is not very commonly used in our field of agricultural economics, let me take a few minutes to explain exactly how it works. The first step in the process is to create a protocol and a series of inclusion criteria. This is what you see here on the left: population, geography, digital services, outcomes, and use facilitators. This is basically the criteria that we give to the computer to go out and search for articles. For example, for population, we wanted an article where small-scale producers or service providers engaged in use or delivery of digital service for agriculture. For geography, we were looking based on a classification of official development assistance that classified countries into low and medium income countries. We also wanted a clearly defined digital agricultural service or a product that was introduced to the target population. We wanted also a very clear description of measurement of impacts from using those services. Now, based on that set of criteria, the computer came back with about 7,000 different articles. So the first round was identifying these, and out of the initial round, about 938 were excluded. You then went to the next round of screening, where the computer screened out records that reduced that number to 7,337. Once you applied the final eligibility criteria and fine-tuned the instrument and selection, you ended up with a total of 315 different articles that were deemed as relevant to the study. Then the final step of that was data extraction, where you go to those 315 articles and we extracted approximately 90 data points that were captured in the paper. And this is a summary that then provides this very rich analysis. Now, before I share with you some of the results, it's important to kind of disaggregate two components. We already discussed here that the services that we have in digital agriculture services are very broad, so we needed to classify those into different groups. So we ended up classifying them into 4 different groups. As you can see here, we had digital advisory and extension, which included extension, human nutrition, livestock information, pest management, soil and land management. Then we had digital financial services that included credit, financial service training, insurance, payments, services, and subsidies. And then we had digital farm tools, digitized farm tools that included farm management software and anything that we classified as precision agriculture. And lastly, under market linkages, we had agricultural inputs, output markets, service provider links, and supply chain management. Now, to complement that, we had to look on the outcome side, because all these different interventions can also result in different outcomes. So on outcomes, we had our outcomes classified into 4 different areas. So agriculture-led growth, that includes income, productivity, yield, practice change, market efficiency. Then we looked at resilience and risk, which included resilience mitigation, cost effectiveness, climate resilience, community cohesion. And then we looked at another outcome is healthy planet, healthy people. And there we were looking at environmental sustainability as a measure and improving household nutrition as another measure. And lastly, we were looking at inclusion, empowerment, and agency. And under that, we were looking at the outcomes of increased knowledge, gender inclusion, social inclusion, and other things that factor in this broader classification of inclusivity and empowerment. Now, one of the key values of this work then is to be able to show you where we have strong evidence supporting impact, where we're lacking evidence, and where the evidence is nil or negative. So this evidence gap maps have 2 things that are mapped on here. On the top axis here, you can see these are the outcomes that we talked about earlier on agricultural-led growth, resilience, risk, health, people, health, planet, and inclusivity and gender and empowerment. On the vertical here, we're going to start with the digital agricultural advisory and extension services. What you see listed here within are the number of articles that showed either positive evidence, nil, or where the idea itself was simply mentioned without really an indication of positive or nil impact. As you can see in this map here, it becomes increasingly evident that when it comes to digital advisory and extension services, there is quite a lot of literature and a lot of evidence supporting positive income for farmers. You can see here there's quite a lot of articles that show this. 21 for market prices and subsidy, extension services 9. When you also look at practice change, you can see a lot of very, very positive evidence, a lot of papers showing you that there is indeed practice change across many different criteria, from agronomy, extension, market prices and subsidies, all the way to climate change. However, you start to see here that when it comes to resilience, there's almost no work being mentioned on cost effectiveness, on climate resilience, on community cohesion, and resilience in general is lacking a lot of evidence. The same applies to healthy people and healthy planet. You would then see a little bit more work when it comes to gender and inclusion on some of these digital agricultural advisory services. We switch now to look at the same map for digital financial services and digitized farm tools. Here, the evidence is extremely thin. You see almost one article per area where you have one at all. And in the rest of this, there's just simply no evidence. There's almost nothing at all under resilience and risk. And again, nothing under healthy planet and people. So you can see that we still have a long way to go before we can get that substantive evidence that we can say for sure that these digital solutions are really having an impact, especially for smallholder farmers. Same thing happens again when it comes to digital market linkages. There is a little bit of positive evidence under output market linkages, and you also have a little bit under practice change, where you have 7 to 10 different articles. But the rest of this, you can see the evidence is either very thin or non-existent at all. And this should all give us a pause for concern as we're trying to have evidence-based policy interventions. We need to be able to produce evidence to show that these interventions are indeed having an impact. Other key findings from this systematic scoping review include the following. We found that research is on the rise. Indeed, more than 50% of the included studies were published in the past 3 years, with the full range going from 2000 to 2020. So for that 20-year period, more than 50% were just from the last 3 years. Also, despite small-scale producers being much of the population that was studied, about 88% of all the studies, only 30% of the studies captured demographics in the study population, including age, education, and sex. We think that there should be more done within this particular area. We also found that the majority of the studies focused on providing farmers with the digital advisory and extension services. You could see that in all the evidence gaps that this is an area where a lot of work has gone in. Also, we found out the value proposition of bundled services is quite compelling. This is where you're able to integrate more than one service. Nearly a third of the bundled services studied described how both awareness and sustainable use of the farmers' social networks increased with in-person recommendation. Lastly, more than 50% of the digital ag services feature some kind of human support. So this is not all entirely digital. It is often complemented with real human beings on the ground. I should add here as well that most of the studies were concentrated in a few countries. Indeed, just 7 countries represented 75% of the published evidence in our dataset. These countries were India, Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. It's quite encouraging that there's quite broad representation of African countries in these studies, and I do encourage you again to go to that website where you can pull the analysis per country. Consistent with the theme of the conference, let's take a moment now to explore how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the digital agricultural services on the continent. So I'll start off with the good news. Indeed, it was Ran Emanuel that said, "You never let a serious crisis go to waste." So when you look at the effect of COVID-19 on digital agriculture services, the first thing you see is that there was indeed a surge in demand for contact-free service provision in all sectors, including agriculture. Everything was being done online. Governments were more open, in some cases forced to digitize their services. They didn't want people coming into offices. We also had accelerated policy and regulatory reform as many government services were moving online. And then support to smallholder farmers came in through the form of smart subsidies that ended up driving a large part of the digitization. So most farmers got free seed and fertilizer as part of the COVID intervention initiatives in many African countries. The big winners out of this, I would say, were e-extension service that saw a big surge, mobile wallet in many countries, remote sensing, e-subsidies, e-commerce, and online marketplaces. I would say basically if there was anything that you could do under COVID-19 that did not involve shaking hands with a human being or breathing the same air as them, that most likely took off under this pandemic. Let's look at the example of Rwanda. This year shows you the year-to-year comparison of the different sectors' performance, Q2 comparison, 2019 versus 2020. That is as a result of the lockdown. You can see that in almost all the areas, everything went down in terms of air transport went down by 95.6%, hotels lost revenue of 62%, education went down 67%, mining and quarry went down by 53%, trade went down by 41%, construction went down, health is the only thing that went up 5%, obviously with people getting sick. And look at that number, ICT went up by 33%. So indeed, this COVID-19 provided an opportunity for anything that was digital. Now, there were other adverse effects from the pandemic that affected provision of digital agricultural services. The first part is that, as we mentioned earlier on, most digital services do indeed require an analog setup. So take an activity like farmer registration. Somebody still needs to go there and do that initial contact before that farmer can be put online. You also, we're realizing now that most of these initiatives do not have a clear revenue model that is driving sustainability or scaling up. So it's quite questionable how long these services will last. Some of them are pure donor initiatives. We have also seen that governments, donor and development finance institutions have been forced to focus on high priorities under this pandemic. And the two most critical sectors have been health and education. So in some countries, agriculture is taking a backseat, and we think this might result in some backsliding of this digital service provision. We're also seeing that this is a very highly fragmented industry with no incentives for sharing data. What you see in most countries is that everybody who comes into the field is trying to develop their own new unique tools. But what farmers really need is one platform where they can do everything from input supply all the way to access markets on a common platform. And it will take a long time before all these platforms can be integrated into one meaningful service provision that's easy to use for farmers. Let me also mention two key areas that are a major concern as somebody who is a researcher in this field. The first one is the mobile phone gender gap. Across Africa, there's a 15% gender gap with 69% of adult women owning a phone compared to 82% for men. And in all the African countries surveyed, women's level of mobile ownership is lower than that of men. If you look here, lastly, under the rural versus urban divide, you see that this gap is even bigger in rural areas. For example, for Mozambique in the urban areas, the gap is 8% compared to 33% in rural areas. For Tanzania, the gap in urban areas is 3% compared to 16% in rural areas. For Cote d'Ivoire, 6% urban, double that amount for rural areas. Kenya, urban is 1%, negative 1% actually, that's quite encouraging. And rural areas is 9%. The rest of them follow almost a similar pattern. This shows us here that we need to think more about access to these technologies for women and realizing that they might not have access to the same technologies as men to allow them access to these services. Another area of growing concern is that our policies and regulations have not reformed at the same speed as the technology. You can see that in many countries, especially in Africa, the legislation on data protection and privacy is still yet to be put in place. 66% of African countries have full legislation in place. Thank God that includes South Africa and a large part of West Africa. But in 10% of the countries, this legislation is still in draft form. And in 19% of the African countries, there is no legislation at all. So you can imagine that without any guidance from government especially, this can go in any number of different ways. Now for a few concluding remarks. Let me start off with the positive. I would think that digital agriculture or digital solutions are a welcome disruptor in an industry or sector that has not seen this level of innovation. There is potential to improve efficiency across the entire food value chain. So we're going to see these technologies are rolled out, more and more improvement, especially when it comes to transaction cost reduction and efficiency. You're going to see more and more improvement in that particular area. We are just getting started. On the bad side, I would say that digital ag is only an enabler. We still have, Africa still has significant challenges. For example, the yield gap is not going to be closed by a cell phone. We still need good seed, good fertilizer, good irrigation, hard infrastructure to be on the ground that farmers can take advantage of if we are going to close that yield gap. Indeed, we saw from the evidence maps that more research is needed before we can make a pronouncement on the broad systemic impact that digital ag solutions are going to have. We also need to unpack this to make sure that the area of service provision, the particular technology, and the particular outcome, development outcome, are disaggregated so that we don't blanket all the digital ag solutions into one bucket. Each one of them, there will be some that will succeed and there will be some that will fail over time. For the researchers in the room, I would say that there is tremendous opportunities here. I think we have to identify knowledge gaps and fill them. Here's a new area where there's very little written and published on, and government and investors need that particular guidance. So it's a unique opportunity to shape policy, regulations, and investment priorities. So we should definitely be putting more research into this space as agricultural economists. We also need more transdisciplinary research. Most of the issues that are emerging out of this field require more than just one discipline. You need to know technology, you need to know law, you need to know social and gender inclusion issues. So we need to have much more collaborative and integrated approach to our research. And lastly, I think there's a new, exciting new potential for real-time and big data applications in the field of agriculture. For a long time in agriculture, it was okay to work with 3 or 4 year old data. I think very soon, as more and more data comes into us, we will need to have much more real-time application of intelligence that can be actioned on by both government and private sector actors. And with that, I would like to say thank you, Danki, Ngiyabonga, Nkosi, and wish you a very successful conference. And I look forward to seeing most of you in person when hopefully things will be back to normal by next year. Thank you very much for this tremendous opportunity, and I hope we keep on keeping on. Thank you.